Good afternoon. My name is Holly Dennany, and I am happy to welcome you to the weekly Lunch and Learn program sponsored by Family Partners of Morris and Sussex County. Today, we have with us Dr. St. Rachel Ustanny. Am I close on the pronunciation? I'm close, who is with an organization called Good Grief, which she is going to tell us all about. Our topic today is understanding and responding to childhood grief. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. I am going to ask folks to stay muted unless you are speaking. And we will also invite you to utilize the chat. If you have a question, if you have a comment, I will be watching the chat for St. Rachel if she sees it and wants to respond, if she can, but we will do the best we can to respond to your questions and concerns, because after all, this is Lunch and Learn. This is your opportunity to have lunch with an expert. So we are it's very important to us that the questions that you have get answered to the best of our ability. So I would like to give you a little background on our speaker today. Dr. St. Rachel Ustanny has over 20 years experience working with nonprofit organizations to improve the quality of life for underrepresented and underserved communities. As a rights advocate, she has represented the government and people of Jamaica in several international spaces, including the United Nations. St. Rachel has a Doctor of Management in Organization Leadership, her Master's in Gender and Development Studies, and her Bachelor's in International Relations and Political Science. And in her spare time, St. Rachel can be found hiking with her children, Taitu and Benjamin, at one of New Jersey's beautiful parks. So before I turn it over to St. Rachel, I'm going to ask you one more question, which is, how long have you been with us in New Jersey?
Since September 2018. So
we are
over
blessed.
2 years.
We are blessed to have you among us, and I am very excited for today's topic because, sadly, grief is something that we are all very familiar with in this pandemic, and I'm just going to also add in that the parents that we talk to, grief can be not just the loss of a loved one. Grief can be loss of normalcy, loss of hopes and expectations. So no one came to hear me talk. I'm going to turn it over to you, St. Rachel. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Holly. I am so grateful for the introduction and for this opportunity to be with all of you today to share a little bit about grief and the work of Good Grief as an organization when it, started doing its work, and, our goals in terms of how we support our families and or intend to continue that support in the long term. Generally, I want to say as well that in terms of our organization's name, Good Grief somewhat may seem like a misnomer. How can grief be good? Why would one call their organization Good Grief? And so the premise of it is our philosophy that grief is normal, it is natural, and it serves a good and important purpose in our lives. With support and community, we can take some of the most difficult moments in our lives and integrate them into our identities in meaningful ways. We can find a new sense of purpose and meaning in the world. And so for us as an organization, grief is something that is supposed to be embraced. It's a part of our growth and development process as individuals. And a little later in my presentation, I'll digress a bit to look at the historical and theoretical approach to grief, talking a bit about Freud and Kubler-Ross, and really centering grief in terms of where it all started and the perceptions that were surrounding grief back in 1917 when Freud was talking about grief and theorizing about grief. And then I'll transcend time a bit and come forward to 2011 with a theorist called Hall. And Hall basically has centered the discussion around grief as something that is good, something that helps us to grow beyond, grow past trauma and grow past death and loss. And so seeing grief as something that is positive, it's one of those things like an emotion that we all experience because we love something and we've lost that thing that we love. So I'll talk a bit about that, and we will move into the discussion about adverse childhood experiences recognizing and acknowledging that those adverse experiences are not centered only around the death of someone or around bereavement, but adverse childhood experiences center around anything that's traumatic in a child's life. And I will share a video clip from a TED Med presentation that Dr. Burke Harris has delivered looking at adverse childhood experiences and, showing how the developing child, how difficult these traumatic experiences are on those children. And therefore, us being adults in their lives, we have a crucial role to play to support them and move them through that process. And grieving is part of helping them to move through that process and learn certain resilient skills as we move along throughout life, that the experiences that we have through grieving, the death of someone, the loss of someone, is something that we take with us to build us up, to make us stronger as we move on through life's journey. I will also talk a bit about our work in terms of the programs that we offer for families, the programs that we offer to organizations as well, because we're in the schools, we're supporting the schools, we're supporting corporate New Jersey and so forth. And so I'll lay a bit of groundwork around that, but I'll also at a high level talk about resilient parenting and how we as parents can parent in a resilient way to support children who are experiencing traumatic situations in their lives. And so I'm excited today to be with you and to share with you. I'm also very excited to share, the statistics that are out there in terms of the experiences that children will have by age 18, by age 25, what percentage of our children will actually be experiencing grief in their lives because they've lost someone who is significant, whether it be a parent, a sibling, or someone else that is important to them. And I think this discussion will help us to better frame or understanding not only about grief, but how to better support the children in our lives, the children we work with, the children in our communities who are in fact experiencing grief. Now, before I get into the meat of my presentation, I'm going to share my screen so that you will be able to see and follow along as I present. So give me 1 second. Okay. And please let me know if you're seeing my screen and it's in show. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you, Holly. Okay, so good grief. For those of you who are unaware about our organization or it's a bit new to you, we are a nonprofit organization that has been around in New Jersey since 2004. Our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. For the most of our organization's history, we have been providing free and unlimited peer support programs at our family support centers in Morristown and Princeton to grieving children and their families. And our support starts as early as delivering supports as early as age 3. So children who are age 3, who have lost someone important in their lives, can come to Good Grief, can benefit from our peer support programs, and we support persons right throughout adulthood as well. Through our education and advocacy programs, we also provide training, curriculum, and resources to schools, hospitals, and healthcare facilities, the funeral industry, corporations, and other entities to empower professionals, parents, and the broader community to increase awareness about support that is needed for families and children who are experiencing loss and adversity. We work tirelessly to ensure that no child ever has to grieve alone. Now, as I said before, one of the things that I'm going to touch on a bit is to talk about the whole theoretical construct and the historical, foundation of grief. And I think this is important for us, while it may seem like a digression from the core, which we're focusing on how does grief look from a experiential standpoint, from a pragmatic standpoint. It is important to know that the conceptual foundation of grief helps to frame how we perceive grief as individuals and how our practitioners go about establishing the programs that they set up to support children and families that are in need of grief support. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the earliest theorists that have been writing and researching about grief is Freud, the well-known Freud. So as early as 1917, Freud presented a theory called grief work, and he published an article or a piece called Mourning and Melancholia. And in that piece, he really delved into what was grief work. He basically said it involves the breaking of ties with the person who has died. It relates to the readjustment to new life circumstances and the building of new relationships. So essentially the breaking of bonds, the discarding of the person who has passed and the establishment of something new. And then later on in 1969, a woman by the name of Kubler-Ross also theorized about grief, and her theory followed a stage process. It's called the stage theory of grief. And in her work On Death and Dying, she argued that grief proceeded along a predictable type of continuum. And many of us, when we're experiencing grief, if we do any research, we'll see very often the stages of grief, and that you will go through one phase and then the next and then the next. But naturally, as human beings, we don't necessarily follow that, that trajectory. We will go through one and move back to one and go forward on one, skipping one and so forth. But essentially, she was the first theorist to basically articulate a stage approach to grief. And she outlined stages such as, being in shock and denial, anger and resentment, guilt, depression, and acceptance. And so certainly for an individual who is grieving, they will feel many of these emotions throughout the process of grief. There are other theorists who have come after Freud and Kubler-Ross. And the one that I will focus on a bit is called Hall. Now, Hall published a research in 2011, and that research he called Beyond Kubler-Ross: Recent Developments in Our Understanding of Grief and Bereavement. And Hall basically proposed that loss provides the possibility for us to grow beyond the post-traumatic experience that's so life-changing, that an individual integrates within their psyche and their being the lessons of loss and resilience, and they use those lessons to go forward in life. Because one can imagine that grief, the grieving of someone who is important in our lives, may be one of the most traumatic experiences that any of us will experience. And so if we're able to grow from that, we certainly take those lessons in the future that will make us stronger and more prepared for other challenges that we face in life. And so the whole idea behind resilience really was born in the work of Hall, and is becoming much more popular. And it's one of the things that for us as Good Grief, that resilience is so crucial. Now, with all of that said, Hall went on to say that the key elements of the longstanding perspectives around grief, so those perspectives that were coming out of the Freud camp and the Kubler-Ross camps, those are increasingly being questioned and challenged in contemporary society and contemporary research around grief. That the whole ideas as well behind depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder that tends to be associated with grief are also being questioned. And that grief is no longer seen as something that's pathological, that's something to be fixed. It's not a problem to be fixed, but rather, as I said before, it's something that's natural and normal and part of us as humanity because we love. And so theorists are now recognizing that there is a healthy role in maintaining continued bonds with the persons who have died in our lives. And so for me, moving forward on a modern conception or definition of grief is very important, which is why I paused a bit at this point in talking about our mission to really go through these theories and to present this contemporary conception of grief that has been articulated by Hall. And Hall says, you know, loss and grief are fundamental to human life. Grief is a response to loss, and it includes physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, spiritual manifestations. It's natural, it's normal. He went on to also say that grief is the price we pay for love and a natural consequence of forming emotional bonds with people, projects, and possessions. All that we value, we will someday lose, and therefore, all of us someday will grieve. Now, for me, the next thing is what then? Since grief is natural and normal as a response to loss, a grieving child or a grieving individual is not someone to be fixed. Rather, they require suitable support systems to help them adapt healthily to loss. A key support to healthy adaptation is recognizing unhealthy adaptation signs in our children. And some of these unhealthy signs include negative changes in habits or routines that impact their health, such as excessive eating or oversleeping, excessive dieting. There are also developmental regressions. Forgive me. Yes, there are also developmental regressions such as bedwetting and thumb sucking. Self-harm are other, manifestations, suicidal tendencies, alcoholism, drug use, prolonged depression or anxiety such as overwhelming hopelessness, being overly pessimistic, signs of trauma such as heightened fear or terror of a person or situation, and social digressions such as joining gangs or returning late from school, poor performance in school where a child was performing well before, bullying of others, and the use of uncouth language. So where a child was very, nice and lovely before, and we were seeing changes that would appear to us as the observing individual or the key observing individual in that child's life, where we will then, as an adult, as a parent, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that this child may be suffering unhealthy behaviors in response to the grief, the adversity, the trauma that they have experienced. And so without further ado, I will move into looking at the experiences, the statistics. What are the statistics saying about bereavement, about grief among our children? Now, childhood bereavement is a critical issue and an increasingly important one at the national level. The death of a parent, a sibling, or other important person in a child's life has been noted to be one of the most frequently reported disruptive childhood experiences. Understanding the number of children who are impacted by death is therefore essential to help every bereaved child find hope and healing in their lives. Now, the statistics that you're looking at were taken from the childhood bereavement estimation model. And you can Google this, just type in CBEM or childhood bereavement estimation model. And you will be able to see on a state by state as well as a national level what these statistics look like. Where does New Jersey, where is it situated? We're ranked 37th in terms of rates of childhood bereavement across our country. And you'll be able to see the state that is ranked, number one, the state that is, has the least experiences of childhood bereavement. And so when we look at this extract from the model at the national level, essentially what this is saying is that 1 in 14 children in the United States will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the age of 18. And I'll talk a bit about the New Jersey statistics in a moment. We are doing a little bit better than our national statistics, but nevertheless, the stats are still daunting. Essentially, what this 1 in 14 translates to is that 7.2% of children in America, or approximately 5.2 million children, will be bereaved. Essentially, mourning, grieving the loss of a parent or someone significant, usually the parent, in their lives by age 18. Now, by the age of 25, that more than doubles to 13.2 million. And so certainly understanding grief, understanding, how to respond to the negative consequences or the negative behaviors, response mechanisms or response behaviors of children and young people is important for us as practitioners, because when we're able to recognize those negative behaviors that I mentioned not too long ago, it will put us in a position to be able to support children and young people much more, as well as other individuals who are in our lives who may be grieving. Now, I'm just gonna briefly talk about the New Jersey statistics before I move on. So 1 in 14 in the United States, children will experience the death of a parent and will therefore grieve by the time they're 18. At the state level in New Jersey, that's 1 in 15, right? What that translates to in terms of percentage is that 6.6% of children in New Jersey will be bereaved by the age of 18. Mm-hmm. That's approximately 130,000 children across our state. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of children, and no one organization can provide all the support that is needed for so many children in our state. And so for me, this is mind-boggling. It means that many of our children may fall through the crack because we may just not have all the support systems necessary. And that is why it's so important for us as an organization to build our parents up, to provide resilient parenting supports for parents. Because if every parent and caregiver can be a resilient parent, it means that there is greater likelihood for all our children who are bereaved to have the support that they need when that is needed. Now, before I move on from New Jersey, I just want to say that the leading cause of death in New Jersey for young people between ages 0 and 24, the top two are accidents and conditions that relate to birth. For adults between ages 25 and 60, the leading causes are cancer, accidents, and heart disease. And Dr. Burke Harris will talk about the heart disease, briefly mention heart disease in her discussion on TEDMed about the adverse childhood experiences. Now, beyond that, one of the things that I just want to highlight for you in terms of the experience of bereavement in childhood, the county in New Jersey that is most affected is Salem County. Salem County has the highest concentration of children under 18 years old who will experience bereavement issues, who will be grieving by the time they're 18 years. That translates to 1 in 13 children. That's worse than the national statistics. So while New Jersey is doing slightly better than our national stats, Salem County is doing worse than our national statistics. And so if we as service providers want to hone in on those counties, those areas which will need us most, Salem is one of those counties. Now, and cancer is the leading one, the leading cause of death that will result in a child being bereaved in Salem County. Now, moving on. So I've been talking a little bit about adversity and adverse childhood experiences. And so it is important from this scale or graph or chart, you can see that there are different things that will result in adverse childhood experiences. So over the course of a child's life, they will experience one or more of these adversities. So, you know, essentially, from the statistics, it is said that 80% of our children who are exposed to one adverse childhood experience lived with at least one more. So for example, if a child was living with a parent who is addicted to alcohol, it is very likely that they will also be living in an insecure, unsafe environment. A child, 50% of children who are exposed to one adverse childhood experience will be exposed to 3 more. So if you're falling in the 80% bracket, you would have experienced roughly about 1 more. If you're falling in the 50% bracket, 50% of children who are exposed to 1, you'll likely be exposed to 3 more. So childhood adversity has a way of piling up, you know, in an individual's life, and it has a disproportionate impact, particularly on already vulnerable populations. And so in terms of our work, those vulnerable populations and vulnerability can be on several levels. You could be more vulnerable because you have a lower income, you're in a lower income bracket. You could be more vulnerable because you live in an unsafe community. So those populations, those communities of persons are the ones that we should be looking at. And so Salem County, we should be, as practitioners, looking at what is unique, what are the vulnerabilities that exist in Salem County that predispose the children there to experiencing bereavement more than other counties in our state. And so without further ado, I am going to share just about 10 minutes of Dr. Burke Harris's presentation. Are you hearing?
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities, access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a
Okay. So she's going to get into the nitty-gritty of how she responds, but I just wanted to pull a bit from her work there, just to have us think a bit and learn a little bit more about the impact of these adverse childhood experiences, one of which is the death of someone important in our lives. And therefore, how do we help our children to grieve healthily, and acknowledging and recognizing that there are healthy and unhealthy responses to the death of a loved one. Now, research on adverse childhood experiences and childhood bereavement reveals that children who experience the previously discussed adversities that were on the adversities slide may be exposed to several compounded risks. In fact, there is a direct and positive correlation between childhood exposure to adversity and risk factors. Increased exposure to adversity leads to an increase in risk factors. This is especially so when family, school, and community support is limited, leading early-aged children to greater risks to their physical and mental health and cognitive and developmental growth. We can help to manage and mitigate these risks by being intentional about supporting and equipping children to navigate through these various adversities. Now, one of the things that I think is crucial as well for us to be mindful of as practitioners in the field supporting children and also supporting, individuals who may be grieving is the fact that grief, research has shown that there is a significant falling off in supports and support systems for individuals who have experienced the death of a loved one. And what do I mean by falling off? So in the first few days or a week or so of the death of an individual, there is significant rallying around that individual and provision of support for that individual. But as time wanes and passes, that support wanes. And so, oftentimes the waning of support actually happens before the individual or the individuals are ready to be able to manage these new experiences on their own. So in 2018, the New York Life Foundation published the results of its national survey that painted a clear picture of this challenge, revealing that 57% of millennials and Generation Xers who had lost a parent while growing up felt that support tapered off within a mere 3 months of the death of their parent. 21% said it waned after the first month, and another 20% reported that support declined after the first week. Cumulatively, 98% of those surveyed experienced waning support from anywhere between 1 week and 3 months, despite them needing as many as 6 years to move forward after the loss. So you can imagine that a child needs about 6 years to be able to cope with the death of a parent, but they've gotten only about a week or a month worth of support. At the same time, those who lost a parent growing up attest to the relentlessness, long-term nature of grief. When asked how long it took before they could be happy again and move forward after the death of a parent, the mean period or the mean time period was more than 6 years. And grievers' most common response was, "I've never been okay with my loss." 30% of them said that. They identified the top misperception of grief as, just because you seem okay on the outside means that you must be fine on the inside. And so essentially what we're saying is that grieving children and families are lacking the support needed to adequately cope with their loss. Now, this image, basically this, captures that waning support that a grieving child or family experiences over time. And so you can see that within the first month to 3 months, the support is really strong. There is a big rallying around that individual or that family. But by 3 to 6 months, it's really a small handful of persons. And by 6 to 12 months, that gets smaller, and it keeps getting smaller over time. So support fades very quickly for individuals who have experienced the death of someone. Grief reactions are very unique and subjective. No two people will respond in the same way. Even within the same household, each individual grieves differently. It looks differently for each of us. A number of factors will determine our responses to grief: the nature of the loss, the age of the griever, the exposure to a violent death, suffering, nature of the relationship with the deceased, prior mental health, culture, religious traditions, socioeconomic status, access to support. At Good Grief, we build research-driven, developmentally appropriate programming that are responsive to individuals' needs and diverse identities and experiences. So for us, resilience is something that is central to the work that we do. Resilience is a buzzword these days, and really what it means is basically the ability to bounce back, or ability to rebound after some difficult or traumatic experience in our lives. There are lots of great literature on resilience, and at Good Grief, we condense the different aspects of resilience into two factors: supportive relationships with parents and caregivers, teachers, counselors, coaches, and peers. And the other component is the adaptive skills like mindfulness, emotional regulation, coping skills, and empathy. I'm going to share about our programs now and how we go about supporting our families. So over the last 17 years, Good Grief has been supporting grieving children and families through our family support centers in Morristown and Princeton. Our nationally respected programs provide grieving families the support and tools they need to face a lifetime of grief. Our programs are free for families and available as long as they need us while they are working through the death of their person. Our groups are available for children as young as 3 years old, and we support young adults and we support the parents as well. Our family support centers provide a range of supports that are developmentally appropriate. And so we are able to pair children by their age groups and their developmental stage into separate groupings. We have groups for persons who have experienced the death of a spouse. We have support groups that support the siblings who have lost another sibling and so forth. So our supports are developmentally appropriate, recognizing that each individual and at each stage of their lives will have different experiences. And it allows for the individuals that we support to build those peer-to-peer bonds, to have close-knit relationships with individuals who are experiencing something similar to themselves. And so one of the things before I move forward that I really would like to, put a pin on at this time is what I mentioned earlier about resilient parenting. Resilient parenting is designed to help parents and caregivers meet the needs of parentally bereaved children, while also dealing with the feelings of grief that that parent is experiencing. It is based on extensive clinical research that shows that positive measurable outcomes as much as 15 years after parents have received training in these resilient skills. And so the components of resilient parenting skills are helping the children to cope, teaching the parents how to help their children cope, teaching parents effective family rules, how to build rules as part of their system. Because, if you reflect on what I mentioned earlier about the unhealthy coping skills and behaviors, effective family rules will become critical as part of the resilient parenting skills in terms of ensuring that our children are staying on track. Active listening is another skill. Strong family bonds, maintaining those strong family bonds is another one. And then the final one is self-care. Now, one of the other things that we do at Good Grief in supporting our families and our children is we have our Grief Expression Summer Camp, which is hosted every summer. And our Grief Expression Summer Camp essentially provides a space, an artistic and expression space for children to be able to bond with each other, create different art pieces, engage in drama, engage in play activities, and so forth. And it is really a 1 week activity that allows them to get away and be with persons who are going through what they're going through, and at the same time, learning to express themselves in various ways and in a healthy way as well. Now, the other thing that we do at Good Grief is our Good Grief Schools. Now, at Good Grief Schools, it's one of our newest initiatives. And in 2007, we developed this initiative and began providing social emotional learning programs for schools called Roots to Resilience. When we essentially expanded our Roots to Resilience program into Good Grief Schools, we essentially started providing grief support groups in schools, professional development to the teachers, and parent education to the parents of children in those schools. Our approach for this program is the training of local faculty to deliver the student programs, which allows us to equip local professionals, giving them the resources needed to enhance their support to students who are within the school setting and who are grieving. There are 4 components of Good Grief Schools. We have our Good Grief Groups, or Roots to Resilience program, which was one of the earlier manifestations of Good Grief Schools. Our professional development and parent education component is the final piece. Now, the Good Grief also provides training. And we provide training to volunteers. And so that's one of the great things about our work. And, you know, if we reflect again on the approximately 130,000 children in New Jersey who will be bereaved by the age of 18, it is very important for us to build a strong cadre of volunteers who are trained and knowledgeable about grief and knowledgeable about how to support grieving children. And this is something that we do at Good Grief as well. We are continuously recruiting volunteers. We provide training to them, to new volunteers, and we also provide continuing education training to existing volunteers. Our volunteers are superb. Many of them have been with us 10 years, 5 years, 10 years and more. And so that is a reflection of how important they see this work, this grief work, but also how important they see their role in supporting families and communities that are facing the death of someone who they love. We provide advocacy resources, and persons can register on our website to receive our different resources around advocacy. We also have a link on our website where persons can sign up to become a volunteer. Our training is annual, so every year we do a new training of new volunteers. And every year we do continuing education training of existing volunteers in new topics that are coming out on the issue of grief. And so, you know, all our volunteers are able to have the most current information about this field that they are supporting and involved in. And there are different ways to give to Good Grief. As a nonprofit organization, this, you know, aspect of my presentation, I certainly couldn't miss, because as I said before, our services are free to our community and persons can stay as long as they need our support. There is no tapering off of our support. If they need us for 10 years, they're welcome to continue coming for that support for 10 years. But on average, persons tend to stay with us for around 2 years. After about 2 years, we found that they have built the resilience skills to be able to cope and take those skills back to their community and support other persons as well. Good Grief is 100% privately funded. In the last year, we received 52% of our funding from individuals like you. We receive support. No amount is too small, let me say that. I was mightily surprised when I saw, you know, kids contributing $1 out of their lunch money to our organization to continue this great work. 31% come from our events and corporate sponsors. Another 16% come from foundations, and 1% of our funding comes from fees for our educational services. Now, you can help to sustain this mission, and here are some ways. You can donate, no amount is too small. You can spread the word, tell others about Good Grief. You can invite us to your community group or organization or your school to participate in educational and outreach initiatives. And you can support those around you who are facing grief and loss and refer them to Good Grief. And finally, my closing slide. If there are any questions, the floor is now open. And while I leave the floor open to questions, I will stop for a moment on our one of our resources pages. Holly will share this resource page with you, where we're providing COVID-related resources for families, for communities, for schools, and different organizations. Thank you, Holly.
Wow, St. Rachel, that was so much helpful information. And I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this presentation. We will be sharing it with you. And, taking something that St. Rachel suggested, please feel free to share this presentation and the resources that we will send you with a friend, with a neighbor, with a colleague. Because there's so much to be gained from the resources offered by this wonderful organization. And St. Rachel, I just have to go back to the number that 130,000 in New Jersey. And I wonder how that will be affected by COVID, number one. And number two, I was also wondering, ACEs I've heard a lot about, but I just wonder if surviving a pandemic counts too, because when you look at the effect, right? I mean, a lot of our youth have experienced very different things as a result of the pandemic. And I just think that the information you gave us was not only helpful for us being sensitive to our youth, but what we're seeing at Family Partners, which you may be seeing as well, is it seems now that a lot of the helpers that are helping the youth, sometimes the helpers now need help, right? Yeah. This has been a long process. So I just wanted to share, St. Rachel, we had someone say very early on in the presentation, they entered into the chat, Sharon Kelly shared that she has a personal friend that had a very good experience with your organization. As do I know people who you're providing a much needed service and awareness. So I'm looking to see you have lots of thank yous and lots of great presentation comments in the chat. And I just want to remind everybody that, we're here for you for issues like this. We will share this presentation. We want you to share it. We want you to remember that we are here for you, Family Partners. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we try our best to connect you to resources that can help and that can lend support. So I want to thank St. Rachel for making time with us today. Very much important and inspiring presentation too, because I hear you say that resiliency, there are skills that can be learned. Yes. And that can make a difference in the trajectory of how ACEs and or loss is not a sentence. It can be something that we can address and improve an individual's condition over what they've dealt with.
Definitely.
Correct? Okay, that's great. So in closing, I just want to remind folks, we're here every week. This is our spot. If you'd like to have lunch with us, you're welcome to do so. Next week, we'll be talking about tips on finding a therapist. And we also have a speaker next Thursday night who has some really neat, creative ways to help energize caregivers. I don't know if you know this or not, but it can be exhausting. So we have a speaker who's going to share some really creative ways to help caregivers. And we also have a program later this month on support groups, not just support groups with Family Partners, but statewide support groups. Because guess what, folks? Now that we're all online, you can go to any support group you want to go to. It doesn't matter how far away from home it is. You can be in your jammies with your cup of tea and just log on and you've got support at your fingertips. So we'll be telling you about some of those options. And we also have a presentation at the end of the month on stress coping tips with the pandemic, right? A little bit more specifics on resiliency and those skills that you can learn. So I am looking in the chat. I see lots of thank yous and no more questions. So I think I'm going to send everyone on their way to have a wonderful week. And St. Rachel, thank you for not only spending time with us today, but for also just being with an organization that really is making a difference in the lives of our children and our communities. So everyone stay healthy and come see us again, okay?
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.